This is the story of AirAsia X Flight 221. Most of you have heard of AirAsia, but did you know that AirAsia has a long-haul subsidiary called AirAsia X? Flight 221 was an AirAsia X flight. On the 16th of August 2016, an Airbus A330 was flying from Sydney to Kuala Lumpur. The plane had 234 passengers and 10 crew members on board. At about 9:37 p.m., the plane lifted off from Sydney and it turned northwest, bound for Kuala Lumpur. Much of the climb out was uneventful. The plane cruised at 38,000 feet as the passengers settled in for the night. 240 nautical miles from the airport of Alice Springs, the master caution light in the cockpit came on. The flight computer had detected a loss of oil pressure in the right-hand engine, or engine number 2. On the ECAM display, it showed them an error telling them that the pressure was low. The captain immediately took over flying duties from the first officer, and they pulled back power on engine number 2 to idle. They then turned to the handbook. The procedure for this emergency told them to monitor the engine and shut it down if the problem persisted. Despite the engine being at low power, the problem did not go away. They took stock of their situation. They had a low oil pressure warning on the right-hand engine, but other than that, all parameters for the right-hand engine were in the green. They considered the possibility that it might just be a false warning. To test the engine out, they advanced power on the right-hand engine. Right after they did that, the right-hand engine stalled and began vibrating. The computer cut fuel flow to the engine in an attempt to get it under control. Now, the ECAM display showed the warning, engine 2 stall. After a bit, the engine recovered. It wasn't back at 100%, but the vibrations had stopped and the engine was stable. The pilots declared a pan, which is like a mayday but less serious. Right after they did that, the right-hand engine stalled again, bringing the vibrations back. But this time, the engine did not recover. Flight 221 just lost an engine over the middle of nowhere. The crew talked about the state of the engine. Was it damaged? Could they get it back online? They consulted the manuals as they shut their engine down. As all of this happened, they let ATC know that they were planning on diverting to Melbourne. The pilots also talked to technicians on the ground. They also preferred a diversion to Melbourne as they had support assets at Melbourne. But at the end of the day, the decision was the captain's, and he opted for Melbourne. He kept Adelaide as an emergency backup if things got worse. With that, they started their long trek to Melbourne. Can we just talk about the distances involved here for a second? At the time when they declared their pan, Alice Springs was 380 kilometers or 236 miles away. Adelaide was 1,000 kilometers or 621 miles away. And Melbourne was 1,500 kilometers or 932 miles away. That's insane. The flight to two other diversion airports were longer than some short-haul flights. Australia is massive, isn't it? Back to the story. On their way back, they tried to get the engine back up and running, but they were met with a warning that said engine fail, so they left it at that. The manual called for another restart attempt if the engine wasn't damaged. So after a while, they tried again. They were getting close to Melbourne, and having two engines on landing would be great. Attempt number 2 seemed to go better, at least at first, and then the engine started to vibrate, and they did not attempt another engine restart after that. But nothing untoward happened after that. The plane landed safely, and all on board were safe. Before we continue, let's address the elephant in the room. If you paid attention while I read out the alternate airports that they could go to, you might have noticed that one was significantly closer to them than the other two. Alice Springs was just 200 nautical miles or 380 kilometers away. So why didn't they just land there? Alice Springs is a big airport. It has a massive runway that can even accept A380s. So it would have no problems handling an A330. So why didn't they just head to Alice Springs and be done with it? The first reason is that the captain knew that the failure was contained and under control, so the plane would not have any issues flying the extra distance to Adelaide or Melbourne. More importantly, Alice Springs was an uncontrolled airport, which meant that it did not have a control tower. On top of all of this, Alice Springs is not a big city. If you landed there, you'd have to figure out a way to get all of these people back to the city. The logistics made more sense at Adelaide or Melbourne. This is why they opted for Melbourne. What would you have done? Would you have gone to Alice Springs or to Melbourne? I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Now, let's get to that engine that failed. Rolls-Royce looked at the failed engine and they honed in on the high-pressure oil pump in the right-hand engine. A high-pressure oil pump takes oil from its tank and circulates it through the engine. The oil lubricates the parts of the engine, and after it's done that, it returns to the oil tank. They identified no leaks in the system, and the oil tank was full. But when they got to the high-pressure oil pump, they found that the shaft that drove the pump was broken. But the shaft didn't break in the way that it was designed to. The shaft was designed to break in a clean manner, but this break was very uneven. They traced the breaks in the shaft to fatigue cracking, but they couldn't tell what caused the fatigue cracking. This pump had gone through 2,250 cycles or 13,000 hours of operation. Just 6 flights ago, this shaft had been tested and inspected for another engine issue. It was fine and it raised no alarms. But the failed shaft does explain a lot about the flight, especially the surges and vibrations. When the pump failed, oil flow throughout the engine stopped. This deprived high-pressure bearings inside the engine of lubricating oil. Without lubrication, they seized up and the engine eventually failed. Now, the intricacies of language comes into play. When an oil pressure low warning pops up, you thankfully have a checklist to follow. Here's what it said. Thrust lever affected engine to idle. If warning persists, engine master off. It's basically telling pilots, hey, if this problem doesn't go away, shut the engine down. But the crew mistook this instruction. The word persists threw them off. They thought that it meant that they had to wait a while and see if the problem persisted. So they monitored the engine for a while instead of shutting it down. We need to look at their actions in the context of the FCTM, or the Flight Crew Training Manual. Here's what the FCTM had to say about engine emergencies. Quote, the FCTM guidance stated that a flight crew should keep the engine operating unless the procedure required an engine shutdown. End quote. They had misinterpreted the checklist, and the FCTM told them to keep the engine running if possible. Add to this the fact that everything else about the engine looked normal. The oil pressure was the only thing that was off, and with that, the crew decided to add power to the engine. The oil-deprived engine failed. After this, they attempted to restart their engine. You might think, well, that's a reasonable thing to do. Restarting a failed engine makes sense. You're only supposed to do that if the engine is undamaged. Trying to start a damaged engine will damage it even more, making matters worse for you. If your engine is damaged, the best thing you can do is to configure your plane for single-engined flight and to land as soon as possible. In this case, the crew decided that the engine wasn't damaged and attempted a restart, but that was wrong. The FCOM, or the Flight Crew Operational Manual, tells you how to judge if your engine is damaged. Here's a list of things you should check for: explosions, an increase in vibrations, repeated engine stalls, and abnormal indicators. This flight had a lot of those conditions, but the crew still mistakenly assumed that the engine wasn't damaged. So why did they assume that the engine wasn't damaged when it was showing clear signs of damage? The crew fell victim to confirmation bias. They had a view in their mind, and their mind cherry-picked information that supported that view. For example, when they attempted restart number 2, the engine stalled and then failed. To the crew, this didn't register as 2 separate stall events, as the engine stall warning was only visible for a split second. Secondly, they had to look out for abnormal engine readings. Here are a few examples of abnormal engine readings given in the manual: a loss of hydraulic pressure and no rotation inside the engine. On the accident flight, it was just the oil pressure, so they thought that the oil pressure was a false alarm. This mix of misinterpretation and bad calls led to a situation where the engine failed. But can we talk a bit more about that diversion though? Not landing in Alice Springs is understandable. The airport didn't even have a firefighting department. They were stationed off of the airport, but Adelaide was a great choice for them. But the pilots were of the opinion that Adelaide had insufficient firefighting assets at the airport. But Melbourne was a lot further away, and in a situation like this, they should have landed at Adelaide to minimize the risk. In the air, it's all about risk management. Do you fly a bit more to a safer airport with better facilities, or do you land on a runway where help might not come for hours? Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.